I would like to make a brief remark to start off this SDGs Impact Dialogue session. And it is our, first of all, it is our great honor and pleasure indeed to share with you this opportunity. And I would like to thank Mr. Shibusawa, who is a member of steering group of the UNDP SDG Impact. In fact, we recently asked him to become an advisor to our division at the University of Tokyo. And as you know, our university is one of the world leading universities located in Asia. And currently we are promoting a university-wide program contributing to SDGs, which is called the Future Society Initiative. And in order to run this kind of program actively, it is indeed important for us to have different ways of fundraising, including the ones from the market. And in this context, today's topic, SDG Impact, is of our great interest. And today, if I'm correct, we have 3 members from SDG Impact and SDG Impact team, and who they will bring us the ideas of SDGs, SDG Impact funds, and also their standards. And I'm looking forward very much to their talks, and also I'd like to learn more about the market discipline. And although it is now quite difficult, in fact, it's very difficult to organize this kind of meeting, inviting people throughout, from around the world physically, but instead we are very lucky to be able to have this kind of opportunity to participate in this online session program. And I believe this is one of the very few positive outcomes of this situation with the COVID-19. And finally, I'd like to close my speech by thanking all the speakers and the participants here. And once again, the organizer, Mr. Shibusawa, Ken Shibusawa. Thank you so much.
Thank you for remarks, Dr. Fuji. For those, to give you some little bit of context, I'm sure you read in the newspapers that I think the Japanese government is easing some regulations for allowing university to allow to issue bonds. And so for instance, if it's a national university like University of Tokyo, I would imagine their credit rating is same as the government. So in order to make it a little bit more appealing to investors, in the area of something like SDGs, or I guess we have other forms of social bonds. So that would be an area of interest for the University of Tokyo, I think. So Elizabeth, thanks again for joining us, and let me give the stage to you and Rosemary, and I think Fabian's also in with us as well. So.
That's right. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you. And hold on just one moment. Rosemary, can you jump in here? Because our power situation is off here and I've just lost all of my talking points. Anyway, let me just carry on without talking points. But so for those of you who are not familiar with UNDP, UNDP is the network of the UN system. It operates in 170 countries. And it has offices, very established offices throughout the globe. So SDG Impact, I'm the director of SDG Impact. I'm accompanied by my colleagues. We've spent the last 12 months building out a work program that's very much focused on catalyzing investment for the achievement of the SDGs. So UNDP is the steward. It's also the integrator of the Sustainable Development Goals, which means that it has a unique responsibility and role in what SDG enabling investment can be and really needs to achieve. And we know that the decisions that we make over the next few months will be so critical for the progress towards the achievement of the goals. And we also know that governments are not the only source nor the most important source of quick liquidity in this time of pandemic, and that private capital will be so important to meet the needs for the response and for the recovery. Rosemary, you want to move along? So the private sector is really seeking opportunities and has been communicating with us about the need for positive impact and how they can play a more concerted effort, particularly over the last several months. And I think companies are really asking us, how do we translate this new or existing interest in investing to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals into action? And how do we authenticate what it means to be SDG enabling, and how do we demonstrate our contributions, and how do we make more informed decisions that bring us closer to these global goals? Thanks, Rosemary. So the vision for this initiative is really, how do you create a world where all capital flows are advancing on these global goals? And the mission is really to provide investors and businesses with clarity, with insights and tools that are required to support and to authenticate their contributions to the goals. This initiative is unique in the UNDP family in the sense that it was incubated out of the executive office. Really, the administrator suggested that we create an initiative that would somehow drive and bring more private sector finance for the achievement of these goals in ways that would be new. And the organization is not typically working with institutional investors. It's not an investment institution, but it's a very, very deep development institution. So the thinking was, how can we create something new that would drive capital in ways that would build on the development capacity of the organization, the capillarity of the organization operating in so many countries to drive adoption. And so what would be the right tools? And so this is where we've moved in to this initiative where the imperative is, how do you catalyze investments? We're focused on market intelligence, market facilitation, and impact management. This is because business and finance leaders, as I mentioned, want to align their activities with the goals. They don't know the most efficient or effective way to do this. There are no unifying assurance standards today for what constitutes SDG enabling investment. And many investors, as we went through this process, have commented that they don't know how to identify if their investment is aligned, and there's no available market intelligence to understand where development priorities might align with investment opportunities, and where do we find the pipeline for this. So the initiative has three very specific pillars of work. The impact management pillar is where we're developing new practice assurance standards, and my colleagues will be able to walk us through these standards quite specifically because we have time this evening to do that. And the second area of focus is impact intelligence, where we have what we call the SDG investor maps. And this is as well as the development of a new dynamic platform that will host all of the data that is accrued from these maps. And then the third area is impact facilitation, where we're tapping into networks of policymakers and investors and businesses to translate investment opportunities to action through investor convenings and policy dialogues. We've been working hard in the last few weeks really to pivot from a facilitation that would be quite presential to a new virtual facilitation, and what would be the best way to do that. So everything is changing as a result of the pandemic. So on the impact, so what I thought I would do is walk you through a little bit more specifically what we call our impact intelligence pillar, provide an overview of this methodology, and then we'll move to the standards and have a little break in between. So the investor map methodology was developed with the support of a global strategy firm. It was piloted in Brazil at the end of last year. It's really a new market intelligence approach and tool that translates country level data collected by the system into SDG investment opportunities, highlighting where that development need, that political and policy priority, and investor appetite and interest coalesce. The audience for the maps is investors and also corporate actors that are really seeking investment opportunities, very defined with the global goals in mind. These maps are also useful to governments as it helps drive capital, both domestic and foreign, into those priority sectors that align with the development needs. The first step that you see here is to define the national priorities and to distill and compare national development needs and those national policy priorities to identify the sectors where there's demonstrable policy and financial commitment to stimulate kind of development and investment. And I should say that this methodology is based on secondary data that the UN system collects and often that UNDP warehouses and manages. So while it's a robust process that I'll walk you through this funnel, it's also quite attainable because we're doing a deep analysis of secondary data. And then working with that secondary data through this methodology to ground truth it with careful conversations and workshops with both policymakers and private sector actors. So you move from defining the national priorities to identifying the priority subsectors to focus on where you see there is development need and policy and investment momentum. And then you move through this funnel to identify the priority subregions that we focus on, where there's again, both that high development need within each subsector and strong political financial momentum to both spur potential subsector growth. And then we arrive at specific investment opportunity areas that also highlight the impactful business model within that priority subsector and subregion where new capital would really facilitate scale. So the core through this process of this methodology is to synthesize, to analyze, to conduct extensive interviews and arrive at the investment opportunity areas that definitely have an articulated development need, but also there's real investment appetite. And this methodology was codified at the end of last year into a handbook for replication globally across our UNDP country offices. What we're working on now with a UX design user journey, we're working to develop a very dynamic platform to warehouse the data and information of these maps so that we'll be able to help investors search according to the relevant SDG, according to relevant subsector, according to relevant subregion. So the idea is to really have a dynamic opportunity and platform available as a public good through this process. You want to flip, Rosemary? The maps we're in the process now of piloting this methodology quite broadly. We have maps underway and completing in 6 African countries. We've conducted this exercise in Armenia and in Jordan. We're completing the map exercise in China. India, Turkey, and Colombia are well underway. So the plan is to reach up to 20 countries in 2020, making the need for the platform so important. And then what we've done in the last few months is created a partnership actually with PwC to design and roll out an SDG map rapid assessment. This is really an add-on to the established map methodology. The rapid assessments effort is to analyze both public and private sector insights about emerging investment needs and opportunities, very specifically in the COVID-19 context, to provide investors and government with some new insights on perhaps how they need to better direct investments and efforts towards recovery during this pandemic. And this assessment is being piloted right now in the 5 African countries that we have working through the map methodology at the same time. And this is Ghana and Kenya, Nigeria, Rwanda, and Uganda. But the purpose is really to be able to demonstrate some very new business models that are very, that correspond specifically to some of the sectors of the pandemic needs. So moving on, Rosemary. Ken, I know the idea is to have some questions. There's just really one slide on the facilitation, and then maybe we can take a pause.
Okay. Sure.
And ask if there are any questions from the audience on this new methodology. So just quickly, the idea, of course, is once we've developed these investor maps, we very much want to tap into networks of the policymakers. The maps contain very specific data points. They provide information on the regulatory regime. They provide information on the market sizing. So the idea is to do some careful matchmaking among government, investors, companies, to translate how these investment opportunity areas could really move, could arrive at new investment capital as well as new policy momentum. So we are piloting the prototype for these virtual investment forums. We'll be conducting about 4 or 5 virtual forums the last quarter of this year. So if you'd like, we could take a pause here and perhaps there's some questions, and then I'm going to turn to my colleagues to walk us through the bond and the private equity standard structure for us.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that overview. From here, I would like to see if there's any questions from the audience, but because it's a large crowd, we have 88 people on board right now, and I can't see everybody's faces, so I can't see if anybody's raising their hands. But if you have any questions, comments, if you could use the chat to have some comments in there or questions, I would appreciate it very much. While you're thinking about it, I'm just kind of curious to see how many percentage of the people have known about this, actually, this SDGs Impact initiative by the UNDP. And so I have a survey to see, I misspelled, I'm sorry, prior to this event, we are aware of the SDGs Impact, and see what kind of audience. So.
We shall send this form out, right?
Yes, if you just put yes, but not the details, or no. Okay, we have about 65% of 66%. Oh, I guess you guys. Okay, it's currently about 70% of the people have answered so far. And I will close the Tokyo in about. Okay, we have about 70% of the people that have answered. So, so here's the results. So it seems like most people either know about it or have heard about it, and so that's good news. One thing that I wanted to ask, just to clarify with for the audience, is this. There's so many standards out there regarding SDGs Impact right now, and I think a lot of people have have their own initiatives, and just curious to see in that scope, what is UNDP's role for this SDGs Impact?
Sorry, Ken, what is the role of SDG Impact in terms of the overall landscape of standards?
Yeah, because there's so many people out there, established, renowned institutions and groups coming out with standards. And so in that landscape, what is SDGs Impact?
So I know we're going to touch on this because it speaks very much to the heart of the SDG Impact standards that we'll hear about in the second portion of this seminar. But what we've been trying to do is, if you look at this crowded landscape of standards and principles and performance metrics, you'll see that there are quite a few principles, and we've been thoughtful about embedding these principles into our standards. So you have the Principles for Responsible Investment. You have the UN Environment Program has Principles for Responsible Banking. You have the Global Impact Investing Network that has its characteristics, and the IFC has impact management principles. And then on the other side of the landscape, you have a number of different actors and helpfully coming in to develop the performance metrics and benchmarks for how do you measure the SDGs in many instances. And you see a lot of momentum on how do you disclose and how do you measure. What's missing in the landscape is the practice. And we know from the world we're living that changing behavior is so critical, and documenting and understanding and internalizing practice so that we have a transparent blueprint that we're all working from. So what we've been focused on with our standards, and I'm going to allow my colleagues to articulate this very clearly and carefully in the next session, but what we've been focused on is really guiding practice. How do you measure, manage, report, disclose in a consistent and comparable way that speaks to transparency and to scale? And I think this is what differentiates our standards from what you find in the marketplace today.
I see. So is it fair to say with different players coming out, we're trying to come with some common language that anybody can understand? Is that a fair statement?
Right. We're trying to come with a common language and an impact management framework that allows bond issuers or private equity fund managers and soon enterprises to internalize how to measure, manage, report, et cetera.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. We have some questions coming up in the chat already. So initially, first is Miyuki Zenia. She's asking about a searchable platform. Zenia-san, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Okay, thank you very much for Ken-san. I'm very interested in this platform because it's very clear and transparent. I'm
sorry, Zenia, I'm sorry. Can you say what affiliation, which organization you're from?
I'm very interested in this platform because it seems to be a very transparency.
Miyuki-san, sorry, you're from Dialouge Life, right? So please state your affiliation. So
we have many private equity companies come to our office to introduce investment opportunities, but we cannot evaluate the comparison, which is a better one. So it's very useful for us to, we can use this platform to evaluate them. That's my question.
And the answer is yes. We're trying to develop a dynamic platform that would very much help you as an investor and others understand where there are opportunities that align to the goals in different geographies, and to disaggregate that information that comes from our data collection so that you're able to do searches around different SDGs in different geographies and even within subsectors. So this is something that we've just started the development of. We have a number of investors that will be helping us with that user journey to make sure that we test this with the right actors in mind. But this is something that we hope to have available by the end of the year to upload all of this data that we're collecting on very careful spreadsheets as part of this mapping exercise.
Excellent. We also have a question from David Simpson. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Sorry, I just put it in the chat there. I was just wondering, in terms of the proportion of investment that you're anticipating in terms of particularly around impact, or what is your universe that you're kind of going after here? Or is it more just in terms of the evaluation of whatever comes through that channel?
No, I think with a lot of ambition, we'd like to see much more of the capital that professes to be sustainable really adopting our standards and really allocating and demonstrating that their capital is contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. I think in terms of quantification, that's difficult, but clearly the private sector will need to drive the overwhelming majority of the financing for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. government and ODA resources have really diminished significantly. So our job is to create pathways and tools to really move the market to think more thoughtfully and concertedly on how to allocate their capital, align their capital to these goals, and how to actually account for, demonstrate that contribution in a very transparent and clear fashion. And we'll be able to show you this with the standards as we move along in the presentation. Fab, do you want to jump in there? Maybe Fab, I see you online there.
I was just going to say that that in terms of what we're seeing at the moment is, and I think it goes back to that earlier slide where 74% of organisations are referencing the Sustainable Development Goals in their reporting in some way, but in reality, the likelihood is that the majority of that is loosely aligned with the SDGs. It's not necessarily driving change and driving additional capital towards achievement of the SDGs. So, I think that, between the investor maps as well as the standards, providing a framework for users and for investors to actually be able to make more informed decisions about, what investments are actually contributing to the SDGs versus those that are aligned with the SDGs is some of the clarity we're trying to actually provide through this process.
Looks like we have a question from Ms. Yoshida from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Yoshida-san.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this useful, very interesting webinar. I have two questions. One is that I'm very much interested in the countries you are going to focus on for the 2020 and 2021. I recall that probably 2020, you're going to focus on Armenia, Brazil, Jordan, and China. And considering the significant impact of COVID-19, and particularly probably Brazil, I would say, do you have any plan to revisit the priority countries, or you are going to stay with the original plan? That's one. The second question is, I think UNDP has a lot of global offices overseas, and I think I just want you to articulate exactly what's the role of country offices of UNDP around the world. Thank you.
Sure, so thank you for the question. The countries that have already initiated the maps or finished the maps, in the case of Armenia and Jordan, they've completed this investor mapping exercise. China was almost completed in January when things slowed down significantly due to pandemic. So there are a number of countries that you see listed that have already initiated this mapping exercise. New countries that are coming on are somewhat responsive to the crisis. This is somewhat demand driven. We're getting requests from different country offices to undertake this mapping exercise. So we will have altogether in 2020, the expectation is 12 countries from Africa. So we are, and we have several countries that are interested now from Asia and from Latin America. So this is being considered in connection with the pandemic and also with the demand from the country offices to undertake this effort. The way the methodology was developed is it's been codified into a handbook. It's managed entirely by the country offices. The UNDP really manages the process, is responsible for the data and the quality assurance around the data. So this is a UN product with the government. So, which is important because through this exercise, there are a number of conversations that take place with policymakers and with private sector actors. And the role of UNDP as that honest, neutral broker is quite important in being able to collect and manage and to assure the quality of the information. So the country office is very much driving this process with us. And our job is to ensure that the methodology is applied consistently and throughout the globe, so that what we produce in Jordan in terms of investment opportunity areas and the data points that correspond to those investment opportunity areas and business models is comparable to what's being produced in Ghana or Nigeria or Malaysia. So our job as a global program is to ensure the quality, but the the uptake of this program, the demand for these tools is coming from our country offices. And I think our interest is to take what's been a more traditional development institution and position the institution to be able to have these conversations and to drive investors and investment capital towards development goals. So it's really placing UNDP as a broker of information on where there are investment opportunities that align with the goals, and placing UNDP as an actor that can provide diligence support to funds or firms or bond issuers that would like to allocate their capital in more meaningful ways that align with the goals and are looking for that guidance. So that's really how UNDP is operating.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. I see that Kobayashi-san has her hand raised. Kobayashi-san is an independent director for many large Japanese corporations here in Japan. Kobayashi-san?
Hi, thank you very much for this opportunity. Maybe my question is something duplicated from others, but the private sector, they are budgeting and a huge amount of money to contribute to the SDGs. But the issue is that where we should invest those monies. And also the other issue is that how to report the impact to the investors. Because we have the private sector has a lot of pressure from the investors, the world, to contribute to the SDGs, but it needs to be reported and the impact should be counted. So my question is that the UNDP will provide the quality assurance not only at the time of the investment, but also during that the project going on, the UNDP can provide the standardized the result for the investment. Then the private sector, if the UNDP can do that, the private sector can take those numbers and can report to the investors world. So do you think that the continuous assurance and the impact, the measuring they can be provided by UNDP?
So again, we're going to have, I'm giving a preview, but the standards that we've developed have been designed to really guide decision-making and to help investors develop those impact management systems, which we think will provide the necessary tools that investors need and companies need to be able to be thoughtful about how you're setting your impact goals and your SDG goals, how you're measuring, how you're managing, how you're reporting, and the transparency and governance that's inherent in that. So the standards are very much designed to provide that overarching framework and management system so that investors know how to ex ante, during, and ex post report on their contributions. And we'll continue to discuss this as we walk through the standards.
Thank you.
Are you okay, Kobayashi-san? Okay. Okay, well, maybe I think there's a lot of interest regarding the actual standards. So perhaps we can move on to the second half of the discussion.
All right, so I'm going to turn, I think, to Rosemary Addis first, and she will start off this conversation for us. So for those of you who don't know Rosemary, she's been a leader in the impact investment space throughout her career, having founded things like the Australian National Advisory Board for Impact. And so Rosemary, why would you like to get going?
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. And I'd like to thank Ken for facilitating this opportunity today, and thanks to the Vice Chancellor for remarks about the relevance of this, and particularly in the time of COVID that we find ourselves. As Elizabeth said, I am an advisor to her and the team, having spent time across private sector, public sector, and community sector in my career, and I am also assisted and pleased that we have some really excellent colleagues who have experience that they bring. You'll hear in a moment from Fabien Michaud, who is a professor of practice in finance at one of the universities here in Australia, is the co-chair of the Australian Advisory Board on Impact Investing, and has spent decades in finance, including in Standard & Poor's. I'd also just like to acknowledge our colleague Ellen McGuinness, who is the Impact Measurement and Management Coordinator with this initiative at UNDP, who's joined the team recently and is on the call and will be involved in follow-up. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today for this discussion. This initiative is, I think, a really important one for a few reasons. One, as Elizabeth said, this is not business as usual for UNDP, but at this time, it's incredibly important that institutions like this that have a public good mandate and can operate in a competitively neutral way and have a really important stewardship role in relation to the shared goals reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals are stepping forward to take a role. And as many of you will appreciate, at this time, we're all very aware that no one sector will be able to solve for these problems and deliver the solutions that we need and resource them at the scale that is required. And so the importance of UNDP stepping into this space in a way that is truly catalytic to help to drive momentum and help more organisations to see both where the need is and also how they can contribute and to help us to drive more capital to where it's needed to be able to meet the needs of people and the planet is incredibly important. This is a catalytic exercise, as I just said, and so it's intended to help provide the guide rails for organisations and to set some standards and to set an aspiration around what good practice looks like in a way that's genuinely useful to a range of actors. And we're going to share with you the thinking around this that really works up and down the value chain in terms of the activities and investments. And the current standards out for consultation relate to SDG bonds and to private equity. More standards are forthcoming in relation to enterprises that will fill in the corporate side of it in a more holistic way, which the previous question has just gone to. But we really intend for these standards to be useful to actors in different ways. And I'm going to hand to Fabien to take us through the intention and the design of the standards themselves, and then we're really looking forward to a discussion with you around questions you might have and also to explore the next steps. Thanks, Fab.
Thanks, Rosemary, and thanks, Ken, and everyone for having us today. Actually, just going back to the previous question, we were on a call with our colleagues at UNGC just before we joined this call, and they were actually talking about some work that's currently underway around SDG ambitions and thresholds, which is actually looking to provide guidance around specific cross-sector and industry-specific indicators that are linked to SDG thresholds, which is another tool. I think this is an interesting space because so much is happening at the moment. So, that would be something that I think would be useful in the context of the question that was being asked. So, with the standards, we're really trying to, look at how the standards and how this framework can be useful from a number of different perspectives. And I think it's important to say in the first instance, the standards are voluntary. So to the extent that organisations, aren't going through to the level of actually certifying against the standards, in effect, the standards are providing, guidance around actually creating and mapping out internal impact management systems, whether that's from the fund manager perspective or the issuer's perspective, but also from the investor's perspective in thinking about how they frame you know, their investment guidelines and their approach to actually looking at different types of investments. So if we look on this slide, from the perspective of SDG bond issuers or the PE fund managers or enterprises who may be using the standards, we feel it provides a platform to actually be able to translate their intent to action. And at the moment, we see, you know, a gap between the stated intentions and the actions, and some of that, you know, may be, you know, for reasons, you know, as we often see, where there's more marketing of you know, a limited number of things rather than a more holistic approach. But also some of it is probably related to that challenge of actually, you know, taking those high-level intentions and pushing that through the organisation at different levels. You know, even with the best of intention, that change process can be very challenging. It provides, I think, good guidance, and we've had this feedback, especially around the most recent draft of the PE funds. You know, it provides good guidance around how to map internal impact management systems and identify where there are strengths and, you know, still needs to fill gaps. And ultimately to design and model future initiatives and differentiate product offerings in the market to the extent that organisations go through to certifying their practices. For investors, you know, in terms of their processes, it provides some guidance around assessing products that are making SDG claims. Helps to actually, I think, frame investment guidelines and diligence questions. And I think importantly, as a collective, provides some guidance around how to seek greater standardisation of practice in the market. Going to the questions earlier, we see the standards really filling a gap in the current market infrastructure, where the high-level principles are fantastic, and, you know, actually without the high-level principles, it would be hard to be doing what we're doing now. But that in and of themselves, it's not sufficient to actually drive the level of standardisation that's required in the market to really promote development of the market at scale. So, you know, we see very much that standardisation, transparency, assurance, and importantly, capacity building are the preconditions for market development at scale. And that additional standardisation will help reduce information asymmetry, help to improve the quality of market signals, particularly around negative and unintended impacts, and ultimately strengthen impact integrity. Thanks, Rosemary. The interesting thing around impact integrity was we found as we were working on the standards was while we had, you know, had internalised our view of what impact integrity meant, was that actually there's very little that actually defines what impact integrity is. There's been quite a bit around defining what impact, the opposite, looks like, what impact washing or SDG washing looks like. So as part of this exercise, we've actually looked to define impact integrity and look for the elements and attributes of impact integrity, which when you look at the standards, you will see very much integrated through the design of the standards. And what we've really tried to focus on, because you know, integrity itself as a definition tends to have both normative and non-normative aspects to it. We've really tried to focus on the non-normative aspects, which you can apply a more objective screen to. So for instance, around good faith and congruence, we're really looking at, are we you know, providing a framework where we're not overstating positive impacts and we're not understating negative impacts? Are we providing context around impacts and how, you know, and where they sit? From a congruence perspective, are we actually reflecting are we actually reflecting in strategy what we're trying to do? Is there a credible link between what's being done at the instrument level and what's being done at the strategy level? Are we providing the context, the operating context for impact, in that the organisation itself has strong responsible business practices and is committed to that over time? So rather than, you know, having things embedded such as, you know, being honest, which is you know, inherently a little bit more tricky to actually provide assurance against. We're trying to actually focus on the things that you can objectively observe and make a comment and judgment about. Thanks, Rosemary. So really with the standards, we're trying to inform how decisions get made, whose voices get heard, and there's a very strong focus on stakeholder engagement through the standards, and what gets done, prioritised and communicated. So as we mentioned before, our goal is that these are voluntary and freely available to all to use as a resource. They're grounded in the existing principles of practice. We've designed them using a bounded flexibility approach, so really trying to provide the consistency and the shared language to drive comparability over time, but providing ability for innovation and for differentiation in terms of what gets done, and also making sure that the standards are robust and can adapt and move as the market develops and as the context for sustainable development changes as well. We really want to close what we see as the gaps in current market practice that fall short of supporting achieving the SDGs, and collect and codify the best of current practice into a unified impact management system. And a core element of this is defining materiality from the perspective of the impact of the activity and investments or the organisation on stakeholders, being those that experience the impacts rather than on financial materiality in terms of the impact on the investment or organisation. And, a core theme for us has really been to embed feedback loops and continuous improvement, because, this is an area where, no one's doing it perfectly and there's opportunity to learn and grow over time. So we want to try and really create that learning system. The 4 core design elements of the standards has really been to embed the Sustainable Development Goals and the Impact Management Project Conventions as the shared language of impact. We feel that particularly with how the private sector is engaging with the Sustainable Development Goals at the moment, it's quite shallow. And what the Impact Management Project Conventions provide is a consistent framework to provide more insight into the nature and depth of the SDG impact and contribution that's being made. As I mentioned before, embedding stakeholder engagement, much more front and centre through the standards, and providing guidance on what good stakeholder engagement looks like. And also ensuring that as much as possible, we're providing that unifying system that harmonises and enables a lot of the other frameworks and tools that are already in place to be used in a consistent way. Thanks. This slide is here because we're often asked, yeah, that's all good, but can you just provide us a taxonomy? And so we've put this in to talk about why, in the first instance, we're very focused on the standards and the practices and the impact management system, because while taxonomies and metrics are really important, they're not sufficient on their own, and they really need a context to operate in. And we feel that the standards provides that context, so that the taxonomies and metrics that organisations use can be used to best effect. We're also really keen that, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we need innovation. Taxonomies tend to codify what we already know. So while they can be really useful and aid efficiency, at the end of the day, we wanted to create a system where you're not potentially crowding out investment dollars that are actually looking for new solutions that may not yet be embedded in a taxonomy. Thanks. This just gives a view in terms of the interaction between the SDGs and the impact management project, 5 dimensions of impact and ABC classifications. So to the left with the 5 dimensions of impact, which has a set of data categories behind it, the SDGs really sit in the what aspect of that, but then the who, how much contribution and the risk that impact may not occur really gives you much more insight around, you know, around the what in effect, and that by using and running things through the 5 dimensions of impact, we're able to get views about impact that that, you know, fall into these ABC classifications around whether it's acting to avoid harm, so much more internally focused around the organisation's own operations and its indirect operations through its supply chains, or whether it's actually doing that as well as benefiting stakeholders or contributing to advancing the SDGs. So the primary difference between the benefiting stakeholders and contributing to SDGs is around that threshold level. So we would expect that in terms of the who, with benefiting stakeholders, it's, you know, it's a positive thing, but it's probably above you know, the minimum threshold, whereas with contributing to solutions, we're targeting investment towards underserved communities and needs. Thank you. Thank you. So this slide is really just trying to capture the benefit that we see and the real elegance in the IMP framework that enables you to actually balance the setting of the right metrics that are most appropriate and useful at the activity level, but by running that through the framework and the rigorous framework of the 5 dimensions of impact, you're able to classify using the ABC impact classifications, which then provides a level of uniformity and comparability at the portfolio and market level without compromising that flexibility and relevance at the underlying activity level. And it's sort of, you know, it's so in terms of the, you know, what's on the side, we're going up the stairs rather than coming from the other direction, where, you know, what we've seen is that, you know, some organisations, you know, are trying to work out how they can come up with the handful of metrics that will help them, you know, that they can apply across everything irrespective of the context. And, you know, we see that as potentially, you know, landing up with a set of metrics that doesn't really work for anybody and doesn't really drive performance at the underlying activity level. So, you know, this system allows you a lot of flexibility to choose the metrics that make sense at the activity or investment level, but still provides you with comparability at the higher level. So a little bit akin to, you know, the level of differentiation you'd see in a management accounting system versus the more standardised view that you get through financial accounting systems. Thanks, Rosemary. So this is the standards and the overarching logic that we've developed. We've organised the standards around 4 key themes. Strategy, the management approach, the impact management approach internally, transparency and reporting, and governance. And we have 6 standards within that context, 1 standard for each of strategy, transparency and governance, and then 3 in management approach, where the first standard, standard 2, is really looking at the elements of impact management that cover the whole impact management process, and standard 3 focusing more on ex-ante processes, and then 4 is looking at what happens after investment through into after exit. Importantly, with governance, as well as governance, we're also looking here for the operating context for impact management. So they're taking a broader view than the specific fund or the specific instrument bond, and looking at the organisation in terms of their own responsible business practices and how the investment or the fund sits within that context. And the arrows just indicate that wherever possible, what we've tried to do is build in feedback loops so that it becomes a learning system. Thanks, Rosemary. As I mentioned previously, the other thing that we're trying to do is provide that overarching system where other frameworks and tools can be used and become relevant and provide the context about how they're used. So at the strategy level, you know, which are the most relevant SDG targets? Is there strategic alignment, you know, with the organisation? From an impact management approach, you know, which SDG targets are you using? What are the relevant taxonomies? How are you selecting metrics, etc.? And from a transparency perspective, how does this, you know, fit within the relevant reporting frameworks? I'm using GRI or the SDG disclosure recommendations or the integrated reporting framework, etc. And then from a governance perspective, bringing in aspects such as the UN guiding principles for business and human rights and the UN Global Compact's 10 principles, which are also supported with the materials that have been developed by the OECD, as well as board oversight and involvement in and feasibility in the process around impact management for the organisation. And overarching all of that are the, you know, the relevant principles that are already in place in the market. Thank you. The standards are organised with, at the first level, the standard itself, and then for each standard, a number of practice indicators that set out the elements of practice for that standard. We've differentiated at the practice indicator level between core and expanded indicators. So, you know, overall, you know, we're setting a reasonably high bar in terms of expectations, with the view that our primary goal is to provide guidance on what practice that is consistent with achieving the SDGs looks like. But we've recognised that in some instances, you know, it might be, you know, a little bit ahead of the game with some of the indicators, but we don't want to lose those. We still want to be able to provide the guideposts in terms of what best practice and leading practice looks like. So for certification, satisfaction of the core indicators would be specific, but would be sufficient, but to actually apply and be eligible to use the SDG Impact seal, organisations would need to show that they're at least developing in at least half of the expanded indicators as well. For each of the indicators of practice, we provide guidance for users and self-assessors on how they might evidence those practice indicators. And we also provide examples of where organisations or assurers would look to seek evidence of that practice. And then we're building out and providing dynamic resources, including notes and guidance notes and links to resources. And over time, what we would hope to do is work with organisations using the standards to build case studies and make that part of the platform so that it becomes as useful a tool as possible. Thank you. So what I have here on the next 4 slides is just a high-level summary of the core elements that we're trying to capture within each of those 4 core themes that I showed before on the standards slide, which are as relevant across each of the standards. So, so don't talk specifically to the specifics of the PE versus the bonds, but overarching, you know, the core elements that we're looking for, whether it's the enterprise standards or the SDG bond standards or the PE fund standards. So within strategy, the standard is to have clearly defined and contextualised SDG impact intentions and impact goals. So from the standardisation perspective, what we're looking for is some clarity around intentions, that they're aligned with the ABC impact classifications, that the SDGs are being used strategically to make different capital allocation decisions, rather than using the SDGs just as another reporting lens to report current activities differently. That in relation to the impact intentions, that the organisation is setting impact goals that are aligned with those intentions, and that are also set in the context of the SDG targets and national priorities that are informed by meaningful stakeholder engagement, and that include consideration not only of the positive and intended impacts, but more holistically, the negative and unintended impacts through direct operations, but also through supply and value chains. And that there's a process for periodically reviewing and updating those goals to reflect learnings and changes in the sustainable development context. Thanks, Rosemary. With management approach, the standards are around embedding sound impact management practices into design and operations, looking at the ex-ante practices and ensuring that they align the activities of the organisation or the fund to the SDG impact intentions and impact goals that have been set, and that there is an ongoing process for measuring and managing impact performance over time. So some of the things that we're looking for there is really that the organisation has the necessary skills, resources and systems in place to manage impact effectively, processes in place to identify and involve stakeholders in the process and in decision making, alignment of interests, which takes different forms depending on the different sets of standards, but including consideration of aligning performance measurement and incentive structures. The framework and context for selecting and applying impact metrics and taxonomies, the establishing of baselines, thresholds and targets to more systematically drive outcomes and accountability, ex-ante impact assessments, ex-post impact management, and including management of exits to optimise outcomes. And again, reinforcing this through periodical reviews so that improvements are made over time, and as we learn, things are pushed back through the system. On transparency, the standard is really around regular reporting of impact activities and performance, and promoting transparency and comparability. So what we've embedded in the standards is upfront disclosure about the intent and approach. So far, we've worked on the private equity funds and SDG bonds. In both instances, often investors are being asked to invest before the projects or the activities have been selected. So we're looking for that clear view upfront about where the organisation is going to focus their attention. Then regular reporting on the actual impact characteristics and performance, and providing some guidelines in terms of what that looks like. So linked to the specific SDG targets, providing that view in terms of whether it's acting to avoid harm, benefiting stakeholders, or contributing to solutions. In the bond context, given that so much of the current activity is around refinancing activities, being clear about the proportion of new investment versus refinancing, etc. But not getting too far into the detail, because going back to that map in terms of where we saw this filling a gap, there's a lot of work going on around performance reporting and benchmarking, and we see this as just making sure that sufficient information to make informed decision making is going into that process, not necessarily being very specific around what that looks like. We also want to see transparency about limitations and gaps in data or data quality, and also around the trade-offs and the impact risks associated with those activities and investments. And again, once again, periodically reviewing and updating and staying abreast of market developments, so that as things improve, the transparency and reporting framework of organisations reflects that and improves over time as well. Thank you. And finally, around governance, you know, twofold. So the governance practices provide the appropriate operating context for and effective oversight of impact management practices. So we're looking for board involvement and accountability for impact management practices and performance. But we're also looking for organisation-wide commitment to building and continuously improving a culture of adhering to and respecting human rights, in line with the UN Guiding Principles for Human Rights and UNGC's 10 principles, including having the necessary mechanisms in place for resolving, you know, complaints and issues. Thank you. So overall, as well as the standards, what we're trying to develop is a system that will be supported also by independent assurance and impact seal and training. So, so users will be able to use the standards as an internal tool, but then if they wish to and think they're ready, move to actually having that certified. So we're currently working to build out the governance framework around an assurance platform that would organisations to seek independent certification and apply to use an impact seal if they qualify, which would then enable them to differentiate that good practice in the marketplace, and further support that through assurer training and accreditation, but also practitioner training as well. And UNDP is working through Duke University, who's working with a number of other organisations to build out a MOOC that will be available generally, that will support both capacity building, not only in terms of the standards overall, but the IMP conventions and framework. Thank you. And sorry, I'm seeing some things come up in the chat, but they're disappearing too quickly for me to answer, so we'll circle back around to them.
Okay, sorry.
This is just a snapshot of some of the organisations who've worked with us so far, particularly on the private equity side. But we're really keen for as much involvement as possible, so that people can give us, you know, really rich feedback around how we can improve the standards. I think if you look at the first iteration of the PE versus the second iteration, you know, a lot of those changes reflect the thoughtful feedback that has come through the consultation process. So we see that as being, you know, a fundamental part of the development of these tools. So really welcome organisations who would like to be more actively involved in reviewing and trialling the standards with us. Thanks. So, the two sets of standards that are currently out in the market for public consultation is the first consultation round of the SDG Bond standards, and the second consultation for private equity funds. We're about to commence work on enterprises, and I expect that the enterprises and the bond standards will be very closely integrated. So as we work through the enterprise standards, I would expect that we will see some changes potentially to the structure of the SDG bonds, but not necessarily to the essence of what they're trying to achieve, but just to make sure that they marry well together, because ultimately, you know, SDG bonds are instruments of enterprises. So, you know, we see those two sets needing to marry together well. On the website, both sets of standards are available. We have frequently asked questions as well. And we also have a workbook, so that if organisations in providing the feedback would like to work through more systematically and provide feedback against the practice indicators while working through what it means for their organisation or fund, hopefully that's a useful tool that just helps with that process. But as I said before, you know, feedback is very, very much welcome. And that is it. So now maybe I might bring my chat box up and have a look at.
Okay, well, thank you, Vivian.
It was going too fast for me before.
That's fine, that's fine, that's fine. Rosemary, do you have some comments?
I was just going to say, Ken, thank you. I hope people can see this is an aspirational, ambitious initiative one that we think is achievable in terms of unlocking the energy that is out there and the interest that's out there to be contributing more towards the SDGs. And as Fabian explained, to be providing that voluntary system that provides the guidance, as well as the opportunity as assurance and the seal come online to be differentiating good practice and to really start to set the benchmarking around that. So we welcome questions, and I know, Ken, there's some coming through in the chat box. So over to you to moderate the discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rosemary. Yeah, we've got a bunch of questions, so I want to take up all of them. But just initially to set the framework, if I am interested as an issuer of bonds or managing a private equity or eventually enterprise, and I'm interested in the standards, and I'm interested in getting the seal, where do I go? I mean, do I go to you guys, or do I go to somebody else? So the framework for that.
Yeah, so the framework, the framework that's being developed in parallel with the standards at the moment. But the expectation is that UNDP will be involved in the accreditation process of independent certifiers. So to actually go through that process, you would be going to one of the independent certifiers that have been accredited to apply and assure against the standards to actually achieve that.
Okay, so the UNDP accredits the actual people that's doing the assurance. They're independent third party, and
yes,
and in the independent third party, I mean, is there just one independent third party, or is there like a roster of people that?
Yes. So we would be expecting a roster, and at this stage we're still working through the elements, but we would expect that in that accreditation process, there would be a consideration of both organisational factors as well as requirements for the specific certifiers or assurers to have undertaken training and be accredited. So, you know, accreditation at both the organisation and the assessor level.
Okay, so going back to my original question, if I'm interested in getting my standards correct and eventually getting the seal, I can come to UNDP or some site that has a list of roster of assurance, and I can contact them directly. Is that the way you think it'll work out?
Sorry, Rosemary, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say that we're working through quite a careful process at the moment with experts in assurance governance and with ISEAL, who are one of the leading accreditors of sustainability standards, to ensure that the way we set up that accreditation and access to assurers and the governance of the seal all meet the best international benchmarks and are also practical for people to engage with. And so we expect that there will be accredited assurers, that will be there will be a point of contact where you can see who's accredited in your jurisdiction or in your industry, and that's a work in progress that we'll be developing over the next 4 or 5 months, and we expect to have much more detail on that by the last quarter of this year.
I see. Can you give a little bit of background on ISEAL as an organization?
Sure, and Elizabeth, jump in if you'd like to add something on this. ISEAL is one of a handful of organisations that deal with sustainability standards. People will be familiar with organisations like ISO, the International Standards Organisation, that kind of set a benchmark for what good standards should look like, and the governance aspects that ensure that you have clear separation between assurance and the governance of the standards themselves, to ensure that you mitigate conflicts of interest in how the system works, and that there are fair processes for what claims can be made about assurance and a seal, and complaints mechanisms, etc. And so there is recognised benchmarking around how all of that should work to represent good practice and to ensure that it's befitting of an organisation like UNDP in terms of its offering in the market. And so ICIL is one of those independent organisations that sets the international benchmarks for what good sustainability standards are and how they're governed.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so as you mentioned, Phoebe mentioned, there is a site for feedback from investors and other interested participants, and I think it's very important for us in Japan to have that sort of input into this process, and this is exactly what the consultation process is all about, I believe. So, so Elizabeth, is it okay for me to take some questions from you?
Absolutely, and
okay.
Yes, absolutely. In addition, I just want to make sure that the audience knows that the frequently asked questions are guiding questions. There's also a workbook, so there's a way for you to sort of organize your feedback on the website. So I just want to make sure that everybody knows that.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So let's see, in the chat, I see Ms. Saiki Suzuki has a question about PE firms. Maybe you can ask your own question.
Sure, Ken, thank you very much.
Yep.
This is Sakai Suzuki. I'm with Social Investment Partners. We work on providing funding and management support to NPOs and social enterprises, mostly focused in Japan. I was also formerly with a PE firm until about 1.5 years ago. And so as I reflect back on this, this standard seems like a very good tool and a guideline to help people think about this, and also to have people focus more on real impact instead of impact washing. And I believe it's a very welcome tool. But as I think about my former colleagues who are, they are not ill-intended. They, of course, want to do good for the market. At the same time, I think embracing this tool would be a challenge as well, on top of all the challenges that they have in trying to find good investments and making them work. And so I was wondering if there is a mechanism or a way to entice and incentivize PE firms to come on board and to take full advantage of this in thinking through their investments.
Mm. That's a very good question, and I guess the demand side in terms of using, and particularly in terms of moving to that next level of independent certification that that does provide that extra element of in terms of the integrity piece is really important. Interestingly, I think on the PE side, I think that we've seen, possibly more so than, than on the bond side, quite a bit of support, particularly from the specialist impact funds, who are keen to actually see something that can differentiate practice and performance in the market. I think that there's a number of players that are concerned that with a number of new players and mainstream players entering the space, that the credibility of the sector around the impact washing is really, really critical. And at the moment, I see that that's probably the key soft lever in terms of incentivising PE funds in particular to adopt the standards to actually set a better, baseline in the market. But it's, it is tricky because, they are voluntary standards, so there has to be, a value proposition in it for particularly for the counterparty that's going to be applying the standards and paying for the certification if they're moving down that path. On the bond side, I think that the levers will be a little bit different. I think that the primary primary levers there will probably be more driven from investors wanting to see some differentiation and some pushback from that side back onto enterprises to actually be providing more assurance and more standardised practice than necessarily that, you know, coming from the enterprises themselves. Although that being said, I think that there's some you know, leading organisations that are keen to be sort of at the forefront of driving that change. So that's where I see it at the moment. But, you know, it's an interesting debate, I guess, between voluntary standards and you know, mandatory standards, which we're definitely not in the you know, the position to be doing that, versus then you know, a regulatory response that starts to push some onus for more widespread practice. But I'd be interested in your views on if you think there are some levers that we should be pulling.
Just one more clarification. On the bond side, we're seeing quite a bit of interest at the sovereign level, that particularly in markets in Latin America, for instance, where they've never had SDG bonds, really wanting to leapfrog and to understand and import best practice as quickly as possible. So there's quite a bit of interest in going through this process, and a lot of forward thinking about the seal, precisely to differentiate a government issuer, for instance.
I should say too, because I didn't make it clear in the presentation, but because this is associated with practice, we don't see this as a once-off exercise. We see this as something that will need to be repeated over time. It's not a once-off set and forget process. So we're also interested in you know, thinking through the most appropriate sort of time increments between, particularly on the certification side, between certifications, and whether there may be differentiations depending on you know, how established a fund is. You know, if an issuer is just setting up and you're basing the assessment on, you know, what they're promising to do in the future, but there's no track record, maybe that requires an earlier recertification than otherwise. Perhaps if an organisation has a number of elements that come up in the management letter that require rectification, so it's almost like a subject to certification, that, you know, you would want a more speedy recertification to ensure that there's action being taken on those elements. But, you know, we're sort of looking at the potential that, you know, maybe that's an additional lever that we can use to make it as practicable and as cost efficient as possible for organisations, so that, you know, if it's a 2-year process rather than a 1-year process, maybe that's more palatable in terms of you know, embedding that additional cost to move to certification.
Thank you. That kind of leads up to a follow-up question from Zenia-san from Dialouge Life. Zenia-san?
Thank you very much. I'll explain about my questions, but this is the same one as I asked before, but actually the most financial institution is modeled by each country's financial agencies, but private equity is a global firm, so how can who monitor this company's governance of private equity itself? Because there's some companies are very transparent, but some are not so transparent. So I can, we'd like to invest through the impact investment through the private equity fund, but we cannot assure how. So that's one challenge for us as an asset owner. So would you like to explain?
Yeah, so embedded in the standards and standard 5 around transparency is, you know, a minimum, you know, effectively minimum requirements around disclosure and transparency. So being clear upfront in terms of the intentions and, you know, where the fund is intending to, you know, move its money, but then minimum requirements around at least annual reporting on the impact characteristics and impact performance of the fund, and embedding the, you know, embedding the elements of the standards, so that there's so that, you know, part of that is actually providing transparency around the performance of those investments relative to the baselines and thresholds and targets that were set, and you know, transparency around the process that the organisation takes to actually establish those baselines, etc. So you know, so that is a big move, right, for a lot of PE firms, because you know it's a very opaque sector. So, but you know, we're seeing we've got you know, we've got a local example here where you know, an impact manager which has one impact PE fund, you know, has released for the first time, you know, an impact report that provides, you know, a reasonable amount of transparency around the, you know, around the investments in that portfolio. So, you know, that's sort of what we're trying to promote, because I think it's very difficult for investors to make informed decisions if A, there is effectively no transparency and no ongoing view to the performance over time, but B, if everybody's using you know, their own frameworks and language to do that, it makes the task of investors to compare consistently across different investment opportunities very difficult. So, you know, we don't you know, we don't want to be so slavish that you know, you're basically saying this is the way to do things, because that is reducing a lot of opportunity for different and better approaches to emerge. But at the same time, you want to set a level of consistency so that you know, an informed and competent analyst can actually differentiate meaningfully between what's you know, getting moved across their desk when they're trying to make those decisions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Professor Kanye from Keio University has a comment. I kind of touched upon it a little bit earlier about the certification process, but a little bit of clarification, I think. So, Kanye Sensei?
I think he's out.
He's out? Okay. All right. So,
yeah.
but yeah.
I think maybe this is, we need to go back and look at our presentation so it's clearer.
Okay. All right. Okay. So maybe he was clear. Maybe he was clear. So maybe that's why he left. Okay. So Imata-san, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you, Shibusawa-san, for organizing this session. I am Katsuji. I'm serving as a research member for the Impact Measurement and Management Working Group for GSG Japan Committee. Of course, Shibusawa-san is a member of the Japan Committee of GSC, and Rosemary, you are the global chair of GSC. We work closely with the Impact Management Project and then Global Impact Investment Network and others. So my question that I wrote down here is that in the crisis space of principles and standards on sustainable finance, I believe that the SDG Impact stands out in that it provides assurance. But I think this is a tricky part. So two questions for today. One, what do you assure? Is it really the product or the service that generated the impact is being claimed, or the process by which the impact is actually managed, or both? And the second question is, you know, assurance from primarily from whose perspective, and how you making sure that they will be built on that understanding. What I mean by that is that is it really primarily by the investor's perspective, the government perspective, the enterprise perspective, and the beneficiary's perspective, or society as a whole? Because there's a whole range of different issues that can be taken up depending on whose primary perspective you are building your assurance on. So those are two questions.
So, so in terms of the primary focus of you know, what we're trying to focus on with assurance, it's very much around the practices. So assuring the practices and how things are done. It's a very live question, and as Rosemary said before, you know, we're currently working through the elements around the assurance of or the governance of the assurance framework itself. And obviously at a point there's a connection between impact performance and the practices, if for no other reason than quality assurance of the standards themselves. If the standards don't lead to better performance or consistent or good performance, then, you know, that's an indication either that there's issues with the standards themselves or issues with how they're being assured. So, you know, I don't think we have a firm answer for you on that question in terms of where the line will be drawn, but it's certainly a live issue that we're looking at the moment in the development of that governance framework. But overarching, what we're really trying to focus on is the practices, and to shift mindsets to focus on how things are done, not just the what. That ultimately, you know, and I guess this is, you know, similar to the discussion before around, you know, the fixation on metrics and taxonomies, that you can give to organisations the same what, and you will get vastly different results based on how they went about achieving that. So, you know, that's really the change that we're trying to support through the standards, is that focus on practice and what, so that you drive better performance over time. The assurance on the who's perspective, so I'm not really sure how to answer that question. One of the things that we're trying to make very clear in the standards, that our definition of impact and materiality is very much driven from the perspective of the impact on stakeholders, and stakeholders being those that experience the impacts, and not from a financial materiality perspective in terms of you know, how environmental or social factors might impact the financial performance of the investment or enterprise. So, you know, from that perspective, in terms of the design of the standards and the practice indicators, you know, we're always looking at, you know, how those impacts are being captured, and making sure that in terms of, you know, bringing them in, measuring, managing and reporting impacts, that it's very much from the perspective of that holistic view of all impacts, all material impacts, as they affect the beneficiaries or the end stakeholders. And, you know, the financial materiality, you know, I see very much as being a subset of that. And at the moment, you know, I think a lot of the practices around ESG integration at an investor level tend to focus much more around financial materiality of the investment, not the impact on others. And, you know, while we're seeing some convergence in some areas, so, you know, things like climate, I think from a timeframe perspective and an alignment perspective, we're starting to see convergence around that to a certain degree. You know, a lot of the social factors, I don't think we're there yet. You know, I think that there's still a very strong element of externality, that you can do things where you don't, where from a decision-making perspective, you're not expecting that that's going to have a material financial impact on your firm, even though it may be causing harm to others. So we're really trying to focus on that end stakeholder.
I would just add to Fab's response here that as part of developing the governance of the certification and the seal, there will be very careful attention paid to the claims. So part of answering this question will be that there will be a very clear articulation of what people can say has been certified and to what level it's been certified, and that will all be set out as part of the governance of the accreditation system and the seal. And we'll be very keen to test that with the market and the different stakeholder groups in terms of what's reasonable and what is, it provides that clear communication to the different stakeholders about what's being certified and what's not being certified. That is in development with one of our colleagues who is bringing expertise around this from a number of different standard setting contexts, and we expect to be able to share it early in Q4 for feedback.
And I should just say also to your question that we see that that meaningful stakeholder engagement is really fundamental in terms of achieving that outcome as well. You know, so, you know, at the moment, I think a lot of the stakeholder engagement is we considered stakeholder views in our decision making. We may not have spoken to a stakeholder at all in that process. And we're really looking for, you know, through the standards and the practice indicators for, you know, a much stronger level of engagement, both in terms of defining, you know, what the strategic priorities are up front, but then also in, you know, through the process in terms of, you know, the measuring and the evaluating and giving feedback about the impact over time, and that's a really important aspect of bringing that stakeholder materiality threshold to life.
Thank you very much for your thoughtful responses. We are very much looking forward to be participating in the work in progress work on this one.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question from Mr. Iguchi-san from Nissay Asset Management regarding assurance in the standards, and we also have Mr. Hayashi also from Nissay Asset Management. Would you two like to jump in at this point?
Thank you very much for excellent presentation. I'm very impressed with your way of explaining. And I have one question about, I had one question about the assurance, but my question was the almost explained response to the Mr. Imada's question. But my concern is sometimes the assurer provide the advice to the issuers, and also they assure the reports, assure what they do. So when I saw their reports, assurance reports, so I think as you mentioned, the governance of assurance is very, very important for investors. So that's what I say. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yes, that's taken on board. I think one of the other conversations that we were having earlier this week, around that was also around, the potential of looking within that governance framework at, mandatory rotations and the like, so that, you don't end up, with that, very cozy relationship for a long, for an extended period of time.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hayashi-san, also from Nissay Asset Management, would you like to jump in regarding the question?
Thank you very much. I'm particularly interested in the bond principles, and we have already green bond principles and also social bond principles, and they require the issuers to get third-party independent assurance. So my question is, what is the key difference or uniqueness of bond standards compared to the existing principles? Thank you.
So I see the two really high level and fundamental differences between the SDG Impact standards for bonds and the the current ICMA framework, to me, is twofold. The first is that there is a credible link between the activities being financed and the organisation's strategy, so that it's not opportunistic. It's really embedded in a bigger story around the organisation, moving in a more sustainable direction. Even though the focus is still on the instrument, it may not be that that's an organisation-wide holistic view, but there is an element of the organisation's strategy or sustainability strategy that is moving forward. The other fundamental difference is that there is a broader focus than on the financed activities itself, in terms of, in particular, in terms of responsible business business practices. So, you know, within the ICMA framework, there's basically an exclusive focus on the use of proceeds as they relate to a project, and no issuer screen or broader screen around the issuer itself, whereas embedded in the governance standard is that requirement for the organisation, so the issuer itself, not just as it pertains to the bond issue, has a commitment to responsible business practices and is actually, you know, continuously improving to embed the guiding principles for business and human rights and the 10 principles as set out by the UNGC, and I see that as being the fundamental core differences. There's lots of other bits and pieces around the way. Also within the standards, we've tried to also encapsulate not just use of proceeds bonds, but also SDG bonds that are actually targeting specific outcomes. You know, so they encompass both use of proceeds bonds, but also, you know, bonds like the ANEL issue, which issued a bond with specific SDG targets and goals in mind that you know, its coupons are linked to.
Okay, thank you. That kind of leads to a question by Amma-san regarding the cost of additional cost for certification. So if there's lots of different certification, it's additional cost. Amma-san, would you like to jump in here?
Hi, this is Amma from Daiwa Securities, and I'm also working for Social Innovation and Investment Foundation at a part-time basis. But in Japan, that even with the certification, that a lot of players are already concerned about the complication of the impact management and assessment, and also the need for sophistication of the methodology, and finally the additional costs involved in the measurement and the reporting. So how do you UNDP make sure that the cost concern will be taken care of?
So I think that there's probably two elements to your question. One around the additional costs of actually incorporating impact measurement and management practices and the resourcing of that internally, and then also the potentially the external cost of certification. So, you know, I think that with respect to the latter, you know, while there is an external cost, you know, I think that there are often benefits over time that accrue to organisations that are able to differentiate themselves in the market. And, you know, partly what we've done with the, you know, with the refining of the standards between the first version and the second is also to try and make them as streamlined and you know, focusing in on the core elements as much as possible, so that that process can be as efficient as possible. But you know, you know, I think that there is a cost impost, but you know, on the other side, benefits that may accrue. On the internal side, you know, I think that there's, you know, I think that overall, you know, we're moving more and more to, you know, to an environment where there's just more awareness that that, you know, organisations don't operate in a vacuum. So over time, you know, I'm expecting that you know, that understanding and ability to you know, measure and monitor impact is just going to become more important in an organisational sense. You know, from you know, not only from a risk management perspective, but also an identifying opportunities perspective. One of the things that I think the standards actually offer is an opportunity to actually set up, you know, an impact management system within their organisations akin to, you know, the systems that they have for their financial management systems, that then can drive you know, their internal decision making, as well as their ability to report under different and multiple frameworks externally. And you know, one of my observations is at the moment that, you know, some organisations are responding to different external drivers you know, to report, say, under TCFD or to report under, you know, this framework and to do their sustainability reporting. And it all seems to be coming from the driver of the external stimulus back into the organisation in a fairly ad hoc way. Whereas, you know, I think that the standards can be used to actually develop an internal impact management system that then will provide the one source of truth within the organisation that can help to enable and facilitate better internal decision making about impacts and how they impact the organisation's financial performance, as well as how it might impact their social licence to operate, but also to then be able to feed you know, these external reporting systems from that one source of truth. So, you know, yes, I think that in an upfront sense that there's a commitment to resourcing that and getting it developed, but I also see potentially significant benefits, both in terms of improving the quality of decision making, but also the efficiency of being able to you know, drive the reporting and disclosure requirements that are probably going to only increase over time.
And just quickly on regulating the cost, I think UNDP's job is to provide quality assurance over who is an accredited independent certifier, and to create that marketplace. It would not regulate the cost of the certification, but I think by providing careful quality assurance of who is an independent certifier and making that very public, that marketplace will work itself out.
Yeah, and I would also hope that by UNDP using its, you know, using its ability to actually provide this framework as a public good, that hopefully that the fact that that's actually out there and you've got certifiers, you know, using that framework, that some of the additional margin or cost that organisations charge for their proprietary intellectual property, you know, might hopefully reduce that overall cost. Because, you know, if the platform's there and assurers and the certifiers are just working to that platform, hopefully that's a lower cost model than going to big firms who, you know, who sell, you know, their framework as being better than this framework, but it's all opaque and you don't have the transparency behind it, and, you know, you're sort of paying for that organisational IP rather than, you know, just the delivery of the service.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We need to be wrapping up the session in a couple of minutes. We had some more other questions, but just in sort of wrapping that up, there's a comment that meaningful stakeholder engagement here in Japan among corporates is somewhat weak. And I guess the hope is that—
I think it's just Japan.
Well, the hope is that, you know, we'll use the SDGs Impact as an engagement tool. There's also a comment about activist funds, traditional activist funds, and if they could use impact tools versus the corporations, that might be interesting. There's a question about timeline, which is I'm also interested. I asked a little bit earlier. The next round after the bond, understand, is the enterprise standards, which I would imagine would even attract a wider audience than even today, and that's in a couple of months. That's yes. When the consultation period starts.
Yes, right. So we're starting work on those now. We've actually been talking with the UN Global Compact, who has actually been developing principles for CFOs, Chief Financial Officers, and working with a group of about 25 to 30 CFOs to develop principles, and they're not finalised, but they're well progressed. So what we want to do is actually lean into that and actually try and create that system where you know, the UNGC is working with that group around those principles. It's not as widely, it's a little bit narrower in its focus. But we wanted to see, you know, where that was going, and I think that they're at a developed enough stage that we can start to actually develop the enterprise standards with that as a core cornerstone of the standards. So you know, that work will be basically getting underway pretty quickly. So we would hope to be out in the market, you know, within the next couple of months with with the first consultation draft of the enterprise standards. And that will also give us time to look at the feedback that's coming through the PE funds and also the SDG bonds, because the closing date for that is the 31st of July. And one of the, what we actually did in terms of the timeline in the development so far was we took the development from the feedback from the first consultation draft of the PE funds and actually used that then as the building block to actually develop the first draft of the SDG bond standards. Took what the relevant feedback, and we're going to look to do the same here. So pull the feedback that we receive on the bonds and PE funds into the development of the enterprise standards, so that anything that crosses over all three, we're constantly trying to build on that for the next draft that comes out. So, so that's the process we're taking. And as I said earlier, what we expect with that process is that then there'll be some rethinking in terms of the structure of the SDG bonds. So take into account the feedback we receive through that process, but also what we learn through the development of the enterprise standards to make sure that they marry well in terms of how the family of standards sits at the end. Yeah.
So. Professor Fujii, I understand you have to go to another meeting at 10 o'clock, and I do too, but do you any sort of closing remarks for
Okay, so just briefly, so today it was nice for me to see all this, the fact that this SDG impact or this type of format is attracting so much attention, and throughout Japan in this case, in today's case, I guess. And so at some point, it would be nice if also we could put this practice or format in place for our activity. And I have also quite a few things that I want to discuss, but I hope I could get some other occasion to do that.
Definitely.
And
Absolutely.
one thing I would add is so. It would be nice if we could share the slides that you use for presentation afterwards.
Yes.
And with that, thank you so much for all these presentations and all this arrangement. And with that, I'm so sorry to say that I need to leave now. But,
it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah, you could continue on with the session. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Fujii.
Thank you very much.
That's the new normal of meetings. You have to jump to another meeting.
Yes.
But thank you so much. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Exactly. Thank you, Dr. Fujii.
So much. Yeah.
Elizabeth, Fabian, and Rosemary, thank you so much for spending your 2 hours with us. We had pretty active feedback from our audience, and how it was helpful for you for some input from Japan into the process. And so we look forward to being engaged in the further enterprise and otherness.
And we would love feedback from this community and from Japanese organisations. My background, I worked with S&P for many years, and I did a lot of work in the criteria development perspective, and I had 2 countries in our global network that I always wanted feedback from. It was Japan and France. It was always the most thoughtful and very particular feedback, so I welcome feedback from Japan.
Okay, excellent. All right. Okay, well,
so Ken,
please,
thank you.
yes.
Thank you on behalf of all of us.
Sure.
It's been a real pleasure and an opportunity to be able to present to this really esteemed audience. So
Thank you.
we really value the opportunity and look forward to getting some feedback.
Great, thank you so much. So really appreciate your time, and please stay safe in this still world. And so we'll hope we'll keep in touch. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
皆さんどうもありがとうございました。お疲れ様。すいません。ちょっと時々、ちょっとこうテクニカルディフ、ちょっと、YouTube でご覧になった方、すいません。ちょっと、リンク先がちょっと間違ってたみたいで、申し訳ないんですけど、後でこれを、リンクを、正しいリンク皆さんとシェアしますので、よろしくお願いします。はい。それでは今日お疲れ様でした。ありがとうございました。失礼します。